Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and welcome everyone. I'm just going to share my screen and we can make a start. Okay, I'm just going to confirm with Alex that you can see that screen okay?
Perfect, thank you. We see it clearly, Stuart.
Okay, thank you very much. So again, welcome everyone. It's a real honor to have this, the privilege of presenting to you today. My name is Stuart BLACKSELL. I'm a biosafety professional, but also an active research scientist based in Bangkok, Thailand, working for the University of Oxford as part of the Mahidol-Oxford Tropical Medicine Research Unit. I've been working in Southeast Asia for the last 33 years actually, and been with the University of Oxford for about 20 years. I head up a large biosafety and safety area, and we also do active research in the area of Biorisk and Zoonosis. And as Alex very kindly mentioned, I'm also on the editorial team for the LBM4 and also leading a couple of the monographs. And what I wanted to do today was just to give you an idea of where the LBM4 sits in terms of the latest guidance in terms of biosafety, but also what I believe are the implications for LMIC countries, given that or labs based in this area, simply because this is where my labs are based, and so we're actually running programs associated with these challenges. So I also wanted to give you some insight into the development of the COVID-19 biosafety guidance, just to give you an idea of how things work in terms of that development. So without further ado, just looking at some of the, as I mentioned, the details relating to the evolution. I want to talk a little bit about the contents and how it differs from the previous editions. And as mentioned, how the advice will differ and what are the implications, and also with the implications for the neglected tropical diseases that we work with. And I'm going to focus on rickettsial pathogens because they are very dear to me. So I'm assuming that all of you come from a biosafety or a biocontainment background, but for those of you who don't and maybe more generalists, I think it's important to have a context for what it is. And really, it's providing a safe working environment. And I always think of biosafety and all of the underpinnings of biosafety as like insurance. It's an investment in safety, and you'll be glad to have it if the worst case scenario does occur. And it's looking at what we're doing in the lab, making sure that we're not at home to bad practices. We're ensuring that we're providing a safe working environment. And really, it's just looking at all of the risks involved and reducing those risks, or at least putting in place mitigations. Now, of course, that requires a great deal of knowledge and understanding of work practices and knowledge of the pathogens as well. So this type of information is what we've actually used to build upon to develop the latest LBM4 documentation. But even taking these first steps when we're talking about biosafety and guidance, and what approach do we take? Well, why do we need this particular document? Why do we need this global biosafety manual? Well, as we've seen with COVID-19, I think every country has taken a slightly different approach to how they've responded to COVID-19. But wouldn't it be nice if we all had a harmonized approach? So if we can have a harmonized approach, at least on a few things in life, and especially those things that really matter in the laboratory, such as safety, then at least we can come up with a standardized approach to management of the risks and the problems that we may encounter in the laboratory. So the reason why we have this guidance, these manuals, is to provide that harmonized approach. And I've just detailed a few areas in this slide. So it's the management, it's the standardization of PPE, how to deal with emergencies, design of laboratories, and one that's always causing a lot of conjecture, and that is disinfection and decontamination. And in many cases, this document becomes the default national guidance in the absence of a national plan for biosafety or national guidance. So I guess the opposite to that is such as the US BMBL, which is the regulatory document from US NIH CDC. So that is already in place in the US. However, in many countries, there is no national document, and that's where the LBM4 or the LBM does have its place in a national document package. What's important to know, though, is that the LBM is not a regulatory document. It's a guidance document. So in many cases, we see that the LBM becomes a guidance document to national governments when they're developing their own biosafety guidelines. So again, very important document in terms of providing a basis and the underpinnings for national and international guidance. So a little bit of history. So I started working in labs back in 1982, and I was working in BSL-4 labs back in 83 in Australia. And I can remember when the first version of the LBM came out, because until then there was really not very much. There was very little available in terms of laboratory biosafety, even though we were working in a BSL-4 lab. So in that particular document, there was the introduction of risk groups, so the categorization of risk, and then lab classifications of different types of containments. But in this particular document, the BSL or the biosafety level had not yet been defined. I think what's also important to recognize with this particular document, it was back in the day when we were using classical techniques. Now, I'm a virologist by training, so we were doing in vitro isolation and serology. That was really all we were doing. We weren't doing PCR or any molecular techniques. So that particular document, if the first edition, was very much a first stab at providing some regulatory some guidance in terms of biosafety. So rolling around to 2004, and you've got the red version, which is the third edition, and that was that's become the document that many people are familiar with, and it became a global default standard. However, there are a couple of problems with that document, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But recognizing that technology has developed enormously, even in the 16 years or 17 years since it was first published, there was a real need to update the knowledge. And personally, as a laboratory user, I found that particular document, the third edition, to be pretty hard to read. You know, very text dense, not that many tables. So it was really time to freshen it up, and bring it into the new world of the diagnostics and the procedures that we have nowadays. But it does have a big problem. And before I can address the problem, I need to provide you with some little bit of biosafety 101. So we need to know we need to define what is a risk group and what is a biosafety level. So for all of you in the audience who know this already, I apologize, but it's important that we deal with this. So the risk group is looking at the relative hazard of a pathogen or an infectious agent. And that goes from risk group 1, which is not hazardous, right through to risk group 4, which is Ebola and Lassa fever. And then the biosafety level is the containment level and the work practices. So biosafety level, we talk about BSL-1 right through to BSL-4, which is maximum containment. So risk groups and biosafety levels, two different things. And just to state this, there's no such thing as a BSL-3 agent or organism. I often hear this said. It is wrong. It's either a risk group 3 or a risk group 2 pathogen. There's no such thing as a BSL-3 agent. And the reason why we have this is this confusion is simply because of one of the mistakes that's in the 3rd edition. So what we have done with the LBM4 is we have decoupled risk groups and biosafety levels. And because there is this major misconception out there in the world that if you are working with a risk group 2 or a risk group, let's say risk group 3 pathogen, then you must work with it at BSL-3. And that's just wrong. It depends on actually what you're doing with the pathogen. So let's go to the offending paragraphs. First page of the 3rd edition. It says, Table 2 relates to but does not equate, make equal, risk groups to the biosafety level. Unfortunately, on the 2nd page, on the very next page, the table, which everyone looks at, and of course, human nature being as it is, we always just look at the table. We don't look at the text. But what it does is that it equates risk groups and biosafety levels. So what it has done is it has almost set in stone this misnomer, this misconception that risk groups equal biosafety levels. But that's really not the case. It depends on what you're doing with the pathogen. So that's why this LBM3 needed to be revised. So that really set the stone or cast the die, I should say, for what we wanted to do with this particular revision. So as it says here, we have the pathogen, and then we've got the process, what we're doing with it, and then that determines the risk for what we're actually doing. So if we're just plating out some blood onto an agar plate to try and determine if there is a pathogen in the blood, then that's a reasonably low risk activity. However, if I'm growing up many litres of Burkholderia pseudomallei in a culture vessel, that's a completely different activity. And it could be argued that depending on the circumstances, the risk groups could be similar, depending on the circumstances. So the important thing to remember here is the pathogen and the process decides or determines the risk. So a little bit more history here. So in 2014 and 2016, there were biosafety advisory group meetings in Geneva, and in 2014, especially, we decided to revise the LBM, and then in 2016, it was decided what form those modifications would take, I should say. And this is the Editorial Committee. So the committee is still together, and but we spent most of our time working on the development of the document between 2015 and 2020. And essentially we're a group of subject matter experts, but there's only really 6 of us. We had 12 face-to-face meetings, numerous teleconferences, don't ask me how many emails. And the good thing is we're still friends. So there wasn't too many arguments, although there was a lot of robust discussions. Over on the far left of this group photograph, you can see Dr. Kaz Kojima, who was the project coordinator, project manager from WHO. During this process, because we realized that some of what we were doing would be controversial, we developed a position paper which we published in Science in 2018, and that was well received. And on that basis, we found that that was an endorsement to move forward with the LBM4. So we're now moving to the LBM4 itself. So it was released in late December. There is a single core document and 7 companion monographs. And it can be found on the WHO website as a suite of documents. And I would encourage you to do a very simple search to find it. So what are the changes? What are the key differences with this particular document? Well, I've already mentioned about the decoupling of the risk groups and the biosafety levels, but in doing that, it's placed more focus on people. So what are we actually doing in the lab? And far less focus on buildings, because there was this explosion of building of high containment labs, often with no thought for what was going to be worked in it. So again, looking at the practical, looking at the risk-based and the evidence-based aspects of what we're working with, and really focusing on good microbiological practices, focusing on the person in the lab, making sure they can work safely, and also working with what we have in terms of laboratories. So these are what we would call sustainable facilities. So there's no need to go and build high containment laboratories if there is no specific need to do so. If the risk assessment says that you should, sure, but only if your risk assessment indicates that. So in terms of what's covered in the LBM, it's fairly standard fare. However, far more emphasis on the risk assessments, and then the different levels of containment and how they mix together with the different risk mitigation strategies. And I'll be talking more about those in a moment. We call those the core requirements, heightened control measures, and maximum containment measures. Also, there's guidance about transportation, about program management, biosecurity, and international and national biosafety oversight. What's important to recognize is the document itself. It really is an overview of laboratory biosafety. And we thought that if we wanted to provide the level of detail that we thought was necessary, then it would end up being a 300-page document, and we were loath to do that. So that's why we've developed a number of companion monographs, so they can be examined separately as a deep dive into the details behind, for example, in risk assessment, for example, or program management. There are individual monographs dealing with those. Okay, so let's do a little bit more digging. So how has the LBM4 changed from the LBM3? Well, I've mentioned before, probably the biggest and most controversial aspect was to the removal of biosafety levels. So we don't refer to BSL2 or BSL3. We refer to core requirements or heightened control measures. So I'll talk more about this in a moment, but the main thing is that we don't want to exclude laboratories on the basis of the containment level or the perceived containment level. And so what that means is that when we were considering how to develop this guidance, we looked at, well, what are the majority of the laboratories that we're servicing with this document? And in fact, we knew very well that the vast majority of laboratories were not research facilities working on highly infectious pathogens. The vast majority, of course, are hospital laboratories or clinical settings. And so what that meant was that we very much focused on those laboratories and making sure that those laboratories are working in a safe manner. So we call those core requirements. So that means the physical attributes of the laboratory, but also the working practices of the staff in the laboratory. And then the next level is heightened control measures. So a heightened control measure would be something like a biological safety cabinet or additional PPE. But if the risk assessment indicates, then you might have to have directional airflow. So again, it depends on what you're doing, and it depends on the risk assessment. What we're trying to do is we're trying to take away some of this madness of the continuous construction of high containment laboratories and really examining what we're doing prior to building laboratories. So as stated in this slide, more focus on good microbiological practices and procedures, competency of staff, and ensuring that if we are training staff that they can actually demonstrate competence, and more focus on the core users, which are hospital labs, and less on the high containment labs. So there's a little bit of repetition here. So as mentioned, very much focusing on our core constituency, which is small labs, hospital labs, regular labs. But the core requirements and the core, which is the majority of laboratories, very much focusing on the people. So codes of conduct, I mentioned competency before, having standardized training, ensuring that the staff are well monitored, and this is the basis on which we wish to work. There has been far too much emphasis on the lab, but in my experience, laboratories are inherently safe. It's only when you put people in them that they become dangerous. So the focus is very much on people. And when we're talking about the human factor, we're talking about standard training. And in the document, in the LBM4, there is a table on what areas should be covered as part of training. And it's very important that when we have new starters, that they receive standardized training, that they are judged to be competent in the laboratory. In my laboratory, for example, every new starter must work 40 hours with their buddy, and they have to demonstrate competency before they can work independently. And this is really, really important, because unless they can demonstrate competency, then they are a hazard to themselves and to others. Now, those of you who are bacteriologists will be familiar with these, well, they would be aware that there is a big difference between these two plates that you see in this slide. One of them is streaking out a plate to end up with single colonies, and that's best practice. But then you can also see a badly streaked plate where there is no single colonies for subculture, and that's a good example of bad practice. So I mentioned about core laboratories and core requirements, I should say. And then we do recognize that as the risk, or as the risk group increases, or as the practices become more risky, as the risk increases, then we need to introduce heightened control measures. And as mentioned before, these heightened control measures may center around biocontainment, such as a biological safety cabinet or different PPE. Let's have a look at an example to highlight this particular phenomenon. So here we have TB, and we've got two particular procedures that we're performing in the laboratory. The first one is an AFB stain, a Ziehl-Neelsen stain, or maybe just processing a specimen to be then loaded into a GeneXpert cartridge. Now, this is what we would consider to be a low or medium risk activity, and while there is the possibility of aerosol exposure and a splash possibility, then we need to contain that. However, it is still considered to be a low to medium risk activity, and you would likely just need some ventilated workstation, but you could also work within a biological safety cabinet. Now let's have a look at the types of heightened control measures that you'd want to implement. Well, I think we agree that you wouldn't be processing TB specimens in a core laboratory, so where it's core laboratory plus heightened control measures. And so the PPE, as stated here, is standard PPE. The laboratory itself, the containment, would be a core lab, but you would likely want to work in a validated biological safety cabinet. And then you've got the standard practices when working in laboratory, restricted access, staff training, so on and so forth. But then if we're going to be culturing the TB, which is a far higher risk activity, you know, if we're using LJ slopes and then we're culturing for long periods of time, from weeks or months, then that really does become a problem in terms of the risk, especially if there is if the cultures are being handled and if they were to be dropped, or if there was to be an exposure. And in that case, you really do have to increase the risk mitigation, and then you need to introduce directional airflow into the laboratory so that if there was an accident, then you wouldn't contaminate the outside environment. So what we're meaning here is that you have directional airflow into the laboratory, or a negative pressure airflow. Oops. Okay, and the final level of containment is maximum containment, and this would commonly be referred to as BSL-4, or an equivalent as BSL-4, and these are highly sophisticated, dedicated laboratories working with pathogens of high consequence. They probably make up less than 1% of our constituency in terms of who would use this manual, and frankly they write their own manuals, they write their own guidance, and there is a user group of maximum containment laboratories worldwide. So this guidance, we need to have something in the document, in the LBM, but we don't need to make it a large focus, simply because they're not our major audience. Okay, so let's take a step back. We've looked at the containment levels, and now we're looking at the documents again. So we're looking at the LBM suite, so the LBM-4 suite, and I mentioned that we've got the core document, which is down in the bottom right of those 8 documents, and then we've got the specific subject-specific monographs, and I won't go through them all individually, but you can see those for yourself. I was involved heavily with the laboratory design and maintenance, and the biological safety cabinets and other primary containment device monographs. And again, these are all freely available and downloadable from the WHO website. And these are the detailed documents, the detailed guidance when it comes to the LBM-4. Let's have a little bit of a look, just to give you a flavour of the type of information that's in those documents. So the lab design and maintenance, as I mentioned, this is one that I was heavily involved with. On the left-hand side, you've got the different sections. But if you have a look on the right there, you can see the different types of laboratory containment and requirement. So you've got examples of what one might expect in a core laboratory, followed by heightened control measures if you were working with pathogens of higher consequence and higher risk. And then you've got the next level up, which is even higher levels if you were working, maybe it's the more focusing on the procedures that you're performing in the laboratory, being maybe a higher volume or a higher concentration, that would entail the need for higher levels of control measures. So that gives you an example of the types of information that's contained in this document. Furthermore, we also used the TB example, where I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. It's all contained in the documents, and it's contained on this particular presentation, which you can look at in detail. But you can see here what are the types of measures that you need to consider in terms of the risk assessment, the risk control measures, and what are the outcomes? What do you need to actually implement to make a safe laboratory when you're working and performing these particular activities? So that gives you some idea of what's contained in those documents. Moving now to the Biological Safety Cabinet monograph. What I particularly like about these monographs is we've got some very good examples of or illustrations of the operation of biological safety cabinets. And if you compare it with the US BMBL, I think you'll find that these are far superior, I should say. Our graphic designer did an excellent job. We also provided basic information on the different types of cabinets in terms of specifications. And also what applications the different types of cabinets are used for. Another monograph which I think will be enormously helpful is the Decontamination and Waste Management monograph. I know that I'm often asked about the most appropriate disinfectants and decontamination methodologies, looking at different aspects of compatibility with surfaces and concentrations and effective times with different types of chemicals and compounds. So there's lots of guidance about that in the monographs. We're also, it's not actually contained in these particular monographs, but we have other documents coming out as companion documents that provide basic information, how to prepare bleach solutions, how to prepare and deal with spills, so in a step-by-step manner. So again, instead of just relying on lots and lots of text, which can sometimes be very difficult to deal with, especially if you're in an emergency situation or if you're just trying to get something done in a laboratory in a reasonably timely manner, then you've got guidance in terms of an illustrative example. The PPE monograph is, as you would expect, it's got a lot of information about the different types of PPE, methodologies for donning and doffing, how to prevent self-contamination. There's also decontamination of PPE. So again, all of this is available to you in the monographs, and we have step-by-step illustrations of donning and doffing and a discrimination is made between inner and outer aspects of PPE to ensure that one does not contaminate themselves when removing PPE. Just another aspect, this is not actually contained in a separate monograph. This is contained in the core document, but there's a lot of basic documentation and illustration around the transport aspects. And again, it's just providing up-to-date and usable information relating to the transport of specimens, and also the transport and safe packaging of cultures. I'd just like to raise some interest in dual use. Dual use is something that we should always be aware of, and it's the potential for pathogens, infectious agents, or even chemicals that we work within the laboratory, if they can be used for nefarious purposes or in a harmful way. So there are zoonotic pathogens, for example, which can be used for bioterrorism aspects. And of course, it's a matter of ensuring that we have safeguards and appropriate practices in place to ensure that that doesn't happen. We also have new technologies that are being developed that can potentially change the characteristics of pathogens. I'll talk more about that in a moment, but I just wanted to mention that in the Biosafety Program Management monograph, there is some particularly good, useful information regarding dual use. There's, in that same monograph, there is also guidance regarding inventories. So that's very much relating to biocontainment, biosecurity, and inventories. And really, that particular document, that particular monograph, provides a great deal of practical advice on how to implement and manage your biosafety program in such a way that it's maintaining not only the integrity of the activities in the laboratories, but also the biocontainment, biosecurity, and general biosafety aspects of the laboratory. So what I've reproduced in this slide is an example of an inventory template, which is contained in the Biosafety Program Management monograph. And there's a large number of these different templates that are contained in the monograph. This is just one example. And emerging risks, again, I don't want to labor these points, but what's important to understand is that we have technologies emerging, such as a good example is CRISPR, where you can create pathogens or pathogens with different characteristics than what we would conventionally know. And really, it's a matter of recognizing that many of these technologies do have a downside to them, and it's a matter of regulating and recognizing those particular risks. And so it's everything from recognizing in your own laboratory that there is this risk, but it's also a requirement of journals and those involved in the publication of journal articles that it may not be to our best advantage to publish some materials which could lead to dangerous practices elsewhere. Anyway, I just want to make sure that this is recognised as being something that is being covered within the LBM4. It is something that keeps us it keeps us awake at night. I wanted to just mention some additional training that is available by WHO. It's on a platform called openwho.org, and then we've got two examples here. One on donning and doffing of PPE for COVID, and then IPC as well. Do go and have a look. These are self-paced learning, online training, and they're particularly good. I would also like to recommend the WHO Biosafety Series. They are a suite of videos which were developed around the same time that we were developing the LBM4. And you can see there that there is a great deal of emphasis on good microbiological practices and principles, GMPP, to ensure a safe working environment. So it's focusing on the user, and these are very good training documents. As we move towards the end of the presentation, I just wanted to give you a little bit of insight into the development of the WHO guidance relating to COVID-19. And so the current advice was actually just released just over a week ago, I should say. And again, it is easily searchable using your favorite search engine. The important thing is to note that we have, this is the 5th iteration of the interim guidance. And so the 28th of January guidance is 2021 is the one to look for. We also have a guidance that specifically relates to rapid diagnostic tests. And that is, there is biosafety guidance included there. And the reasons why the guidance is updated and we have these continual iterations is we're learning something new all the time. And sometimes the technology changes, or the rapid diagnostic tests present a biosafety concern. So we have to put in place interventions. And I'm sure that we will end up probably with another interim guidance, but can I please just point out again that make sure that you're applying the most up-to-date guidance. We've had 5 global and regional implementation seminars that I've been involved with anyway, and I'm sure there have been others in other jurisdictions and in other regions, and because the dissemination of this advice is very, very important. I just wanted to give you some context here about how the risk assessment and residual risk for COVID looks when it comes to biosafety. And you can see what we do on the left-hand side. You've got your procedures. So you've got sample collection, serology, or sample reception, RT-PCR. And then where will you work? So core, or use heightened control measures. And then if you are using heightened control measures, then what would they be? So it's biosafety cabinet, or include a respirator. And then what's the residual risk after you've implemented those risk mitigations? So that's essentially, how we see the LBM4 knowledge being applied. Just wanted to make some comments on the point of care testing, or the rapid diagnostic tests. And of course, there's been a few different iterations. We've come a long way in only, just over a year, of course. And again, I go back to the fact that in many laboratories, they might not necessarily have biological safety cabinets, or they might have them, but when was the last time they were validated? So we recognize that this is a constraint. And so we always say that, again, we go back to the staff must be well trained. You need to have most appropriate PPE, and really if some respiratory protection is important, but working in a well ventilated area if you don't have a biological safety cabinet in place. So, and again, validated infectious waste processes are very important, otherwise you're just perpetuating a problem. More recently, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, we have what I call closed system RDTs for the diagnosis of COVID, and these are antigen-based diagnostics. And essentially, these can be processed on the open bench in a well-ventilated area. And this uses a swab, which then goes into the tube, which contains a lysis buffer, and then a cap goes into the top of the tube, and then that's used as the dispenser. And then you read the RDT device after 10 to 15 minutes or a bit longer. But this is quite ingenious, and not all systems have something as elegant as this, but it really does reduce the risk of aerosol or drop exposure, and it also indicates that it can be done in a clinic where there is no biological safety cabinet. So that's just a little bit about the COVID advice and guidance development. I just wanted to end with what I believe are implications for neglected tropical pathogens. And one of the pathogens that I work with is Orientia susugamushi, and the disease is scrub typhus, and it's a widespread disease in Asia, and we find it a real problem because the biosafety advice is actually not it's not compatible with reality, and let's have a talk about that. So how much risk is actually associated with this work in the lab? Well, we always try and work out if it's high, medium or low. But of course, it just depends what you're doing with it, what you're actually doing with the specimen. So are they clinical specimens or are they pure cultures? So how can we work out how dangerous something is? Well, we went back and we had a look at laboratory-acquired infections for these particular pathogens, or this and some other rickettsias. And what we found was that the majority of these laboratory-acquired infections were associated with activities that we would nowadays consider to be very dangerous, such as working on the open bench, working with animals on the open bench, performing necropsies on infected animals on the open bench. So most of the laboratory-acquired infections occurred before 1948. So the reality is, using normal safety precautions, what we would use nowadays, it's not inherently high risk. And as we learned earlier, the bigger misunderstanding is risk groups and biosafety levels. They don't equate. But so you ask, what is the current risk group for Orientia? Well, unfortunately, they were classified as risk group 3, likely due to a historical association with Rocky Mountain spotted fever, which is another rickettsia. So what's the normal biosafety level for Orientia? Where does everyone work? Well, most of the time people work in BSL3 because they've got this misconception about risk group 2 and risk group 3. But it definitely should not only be worked with at BSL3, because quite often the activities we perform are simply not risky. And there is a strong argument for reclassifying this particular organism down to risk group 2, simply because if you look at the definitions of risk groups, it's more suited to being a risk group 2 simply because it doesn't spread in the community. So it's not contagious. It's transmitted by the trombiculid mite. So there's no real good reason for it to be classified as that. So we've recently published recommendations on what we believe are the most appropriate way to work safely with this particular organism. And we hope that it will get reclassified to risk group 2. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. So in summary, more focus on people, less on buildings. Risk-based, evidence-based, sustainable ethos, which we can then take forward into the future and provide us with a safe working environment that is going to be affordable and that we can all be proud of. With that, I would like to say thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.